Hyvää päivää, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of History with the Drywaller. I am your host, the aforementioned Drywaller, and for our first episode, I'm going to do a comprehensive-ish history of Finland. So, let's begin. To start us off, where is Finland? Well, Finland is in the eastern end of what is now called Scandinavia. To its west, or its left, if you prefer, there is Sweden and Norway, and if you cross the ocean, there is England and Iceland and all that. To its east, or its right, there is Russia, and to its southeast, there's the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Now, it is in the north, so it is fairly cold. And in fact, the northern part of Finland is in the Arctic Circle, which has often, I think, quite poetically been called the land of the midnight sun, because in the summertime, the sun only sets for a couple of hours at a time, which I have not had the privilege of seeing myself, but I have been told is both very beautiful and kind of maddening, depending on your personality. But all that to say that Finland is a small country in Scandinavia, and it's up in the north. The population now is only about 5.5 million people, and so it has always been a relatively small country and a relatively isolated community. Now, as far as the history of Finland goes, you get to sort of a difficult question here. It's hard to say when the first humans entered Finland, but one thing that can be said is that during the Paleolithic era, which is about 125,000 years ago, we have the oldest archaeological site in Finland, and that happens to be a site of Neanderthals, which makes it the only Neanderthal site in all of the Nordic countries, which is admittedly kind of an unfortunate thing to be known for, but it is something. But setting aside Neanderthals, we do have, in the Mesolithic era, which is after the last ice age, about 9,000 BC, the first introduction of human, what would be later called Finns. So human Finns have arrived after the last ice age. Now, there is something interesting about the Finns. They arrived out of the Baltic forests and the Ural Mountains of Central Eurasia, and for whatever reason, maybe they like the midnight sun, they decided to settle in Finland, and these people have been there ever since. Now, in the Neolithic era, you get what is now known as the Proto-Finnish language. See, now this is a really interesting part, because unlike essentially the rest of Europe, the Finnish language is not Indo-European. It is actually Uralic, which is to say that it comes from Central Russia, unlike the rest of Europe, essentially, which are almost all Indo-European languages. And when I say the rest of Europe, I mean the rest of Europe. Everything from English to German to French, Spanish, Greek, Italian, almost everything is an Indo-European language family. And then, of course, Persian and Sanskrit and all that, they're all descended from the same language, but not Finnish. And that's fairly rare. The only other languages that are Uralic rather than Indo-European in that region would be some of the languages from the Baltic countries, again, like Estonia and Latvia, Ural peoples in Central Russia, and Hungarian. And that is, as some of you may know, because Hungarians are actually descended from Central Eurasian Magyars. But at any rate, in the Neolithic era, the Finnish language has arrived. And not only that, but the beginnings of real construction and craftsmanship start to emerge in Finland. And by craftsmanship, I mean this is when pottery comes into widespread use, flint and stone tools, and rather surprisingly, an extensive Northern European trade. The Finns were trading with Denmark, with Norway, with Russia, with Estonia. I mean, none of these countries existed at the time, don't get me wrong, but the Finns were trading with people in these areas, is what I'm trying to say. And there were scattered sedentary dwellings, which is to say people living in villages or towns, which in the Neolithic era is relatively unusual. However, these people still were hunter-gatherers. There was no farming or agriculture. They just lived together off what they were able to hunt and gather. It's genuinely hard for me to not picture old 60s animated Christmas movies when I think about a bunch of Finns living together with reindeer in snowy forests. But that's a whole nother strange psychological conundrum. And now, moving past the Neolithic era, you get into the Bronze and the Iron Ages. Now, these sort of run together for Finnish history because the Finns had no writing in this period. So we have no names of kings, no names of countries, no great epics, no nothing, unfortunately. So we have next to no idea what specifically happened to specific people in these eras. But we can make broad inferences about their way of life. Specifically, in the Bronze Age, agriculture and the domestication of livestock were introduced into Finland. And therefore, you get the beginning of real sedentary farming communities, as we would recognize today as sedentary communities. And of course, the Finnish tradition of craftsmanship continues, and the trade that they had established in the Neolithic era continues to grow through the Bronze and Iron Ages. You can find Finnish artifacts being traded in the Mediterranean and even in the Arab world at this time. There's also another interesting thing from this era. I don't know if it's true, but some sources report that the famous Swedish kings, the Yinglings, which, as you may know, include Beowulf, are supposedly descended from Finns. So there you go. I don't know if that's worth much. Beowulf almost certainly didn't exist. That's something. Another comment about the Iron Age. This is a little bit more controversial, but unfortunately, the Finns were not Vikings. The Finns did not take part in the greater Viking world. The Vikings did have some contact with Finns, mostly isolated trading posts and fishing communities. They, as far as I can tell, Finns relatively rarely took part in the famous Viking raids or the famous Viking pirate fleets. Finns today will gladly try to associate themselves with Vikings, but unfortunately, the historical record does not seem to support the identity of Finns as Vikings. And as we mentioned before, the Finnish language is way more Baltic, and the Finnish religion is way more Baltic than it is Norse. Now, on to the Finnish religion. So, before Christianity came from Sweden, the Finns were pagans. That's probably not very surprising. Most pre-Christian regions were pagans, but more specifically, the Finns were polytheists and animists. Now, of course, polytheism means that you have lots of gods, but animism is a little bit more technical. Basically, what animism means is that not only do you worship gods and large, divine concepts, but individual things like rocks and trees and waterfalls can have deep spiritual meaning to the practitioners of animism. Like, for example, in Finland, one of the interesting ways that animism manifested itself is in what is now called cupstones. Now, cupstones were basically really large rocks or rock formations that the Finns were sort of spiritually drawn to, and they would carve these little hollow cups in the stones, and they would give offerings of food or of flowers, and it was a way to really tie themselves to the land and to their ancestors. And as far as the deities go, well, there are a lot, as is not uncommon with polytheistic religions, but I think there's only two gods that we really need to concern ourselves with, and that is Ukko, and he is the god of thunder and lightning, a la Zeus or Odin or Jupiter or Thor. This is not uncommon. Again, Ukko is the god of thunder and lightning, and he is the king of the gods, or the god of gods, so to speak. But there's one other interesting deity in the Finnish pantheon, and that is Jumala, who is the god of the sky. And he's interesting because Jumala is now the modern Finnish word for a monotheistic Christian god. So their word for God, even modern Christian Finns, is the name of their old pagan sky god. Which is intriguing, and I think relatively unusual for pagan polytheistic societies sort of transforming into Christianity. I don't think that usually happens. It should also be known that Finland actually has a really successful neo-pagan revivalist movement. There's actually a lot of modern Finns that have gone back to practicing their old pagan polytheistic religion. It's one of the most successful neo-pagan revivals in the world, which I think just goes to show that this interaction between Christianity and old paganism is still ongoing. It's not a story that has reached its conclusion. But as fascinating as Finnish religion is, and it is, we have talked about it for too long already. We have a lot to cover, and not a lot of time to cover it. So, moving into the Middle Ages, this is where we get the beginning of writing in Finland. And the reason for that is because the Swedes invaded and took over Finland. Now, this is also a difficult topic because there are 3 Swedish crusades that are reported to us. The first one, by my understanding, is considered to be mythical. It's a very fanciful tale of Englishmen who go to Sweden and then go to Finland, and I forget the details, but it's this big, wild, over-the-top thing. It's basically like a road trip movie that became a crusade story. Anyway, then there's 2 more crusades that are sort of likely real, but to me, the upshot of this whole thing is that in 1250 AD, a man named King Valdemar, who is king of Sweden, now rules Finland. And unfortunately, this was not a very fun time to be a Finn. The Swedes, in sort of the classic European way, the Swedes colonized Finland. Finns, especially the pagan Finns, were seen by the Swedes as conquered people and were rarely treated equally. Finland was economically exploited, heavily overtaxed, and yet most of the taxes did not end up benefiting Finland in any meaningful way. This is, unfortunately, a very familiar story of colonization. Now, for the time, it should be noted, this is actually not as bad as it could have been, because Sweden has never adopted feudalism, and therefore, feudalism did not enter Finland. So while the rest of Europe was struggling under a pretty lousy economic and social system, the Finns never had to deal with it. So I guess that's nice. But Finland was now a conquered nation, and it would remain a conquered nation for nearly 1,000 years. But while Finland was under Swedish dominion, they did briefly become part of what's called the Kalmar Union, which is a union of the crowns of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. This gave the whole Swedish Empire, including Finland, much more cosmopolitan and worldly sort of structure. And this improved circumstances quite significantly for the Finns. They were now not just the one odd group out in a Swedish empire, but they were now among many different ethnic groups, and this did improve their social standing in their empire. Even better, at least for the Finns, a wave of social upheaval and class conflict in Sweden wildly destabilized the monarchy, as you can imagine, and this led to the monarchy heavily relying on Finland for support, which meant that the Finns, while not exactly the greater half of the union, had a lot greater say in the governance there of the empire that they were a part of. Now, some people have compared this. I've heard some people compare this to the union between Austria and Hungary, which led to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I haven't seen anything to indicate that it was that level of cooperation, but it is a nice idea. Now, in the 1500s, the Swedish monarchy completely collapsed, and this gave rise to the Vasa royal family in Sweden. And if you know anything about Northern European history, the Vasas are a really big deal. Vasa rule would be a time of expansion, conquest, but also consolidation and modernization in the entire Swedish Empire, which meant Finland. Among these consolidation and modernization moves, Sweden adopted Lutheranism in the late 1500s, which meant that Finland adopted Lutheranism. And the Finns really like their Lutheranism. This will come up again and again, so keep this in mind. The Finns are very dedicated Lutherans to this day. And that is as a direct result of the Vasa rule in the 1500s. Now, Lutheranism aside, everything wasn't all hunky-dory under the Vasas. There was a really nasty war in 1596 called the Cudgel War, which was a Finnish peasant rebellion against Swedish rule and the Finnish nobility, which raged for almost an entire year before being crushed. And there was the larger axe hanging over the Swedish Empire, which was Russia. Russia had grown from the small kingdom of Muscovy around Moscow to be in contention of a spot at the world's power table. And this led directly to conflict with Sweden because Russia decided that Russia wanted Finland. And of course, as we very well know, Sweden had already decided that Sweden wanted Finland. And so it goes. However, before the Finns and the Swedes could deal with the Russians, the current king of Sweden, a man named Gustavus Adolphus, a very famous conqueror in his own right, among his great nicknames was the Lion of the North. This man was basically a real-life Lord of the Rings character, but he decided that it would be a great idea to get involved in the 30 Years' War raging between the Lutherans and the Catholics in Europe. Now, unfortunately, despite being a conquering hero and winning every battle he fought in, to my knowledge, he was killed in one of those battles. That left the crown to my personal favorite of the Vasa royal family, Queen Christina, who is also a really, really great character, and you should 100% go home and look up Christina Vasa because she's great and she's my favorite, and we don't have time to get into her now, but she's awesome. That aside, the loss of Gustavus Adolphus and Christina Vasa abandoning the throne, again, Christina Vasa's awesome, look her up, led to Sweden being weakened and ripe for the picking by Russia. And in the Great Northern War in the early 1700s, Russia struck. Sweden was able to defeat Poland and I believe Denmark, but Russia crushed the Swedish army and Sweden lost Finland to Russia. Now, this was not a great time to be Finnish. The Russians badly mistreated the Finns. Unfortunately, at this point, for the Finns, the Russians considered them to be something of an exotic curiosity because of their blonde hair and their blue eyes. Russians found that they could not only get a high price for Finnish slaves in Russia, but even into the Mediterranean or the Arab world. This, unfortunately, didn't help, or wasn't helped, by the high literacy rate in Finland. This made them very desirable slaves, and unfortunately, in the Russian Empire, slavery was still very possible. It was technically illegal, to my understanding, but the law wasn't meaningfully enforced, and so the Finns were sort of abandoned to the whims of their new Russian overlord. The Russians would call this new slave colony of theirs the Grand Duchy of Finland. And although the Swedes would try several times to reconquer Finland, they would never succeed. The Russians would keep their hold on Finland and, unfortunately, quite badly mistreat the Finnish people for hundreds of years. Part of this mistreatment, actually, was an attempt to stamp out Finnish Lutheranism, which, as we mentioned before, is very important to the Finns, and install Russian Eastern Orthodoxy, which, despite the Russian efforts, never really gained a meaningful foothold in Finland and has almost no followers in Finland today. One interesting side note of this attempt, though, is something called the Laestadian movement. And though this movement didn't have a huge impact on Finland, and by the way, it didn't, it has had a very large impact on Finnish Americans and the Finnish influence in America, if that makes sense. And being a Finnish American myself, I would like to go into it. So, the story of the Laestadian movement starts with a man named Lars Levi Laestadius, and he lived in the early to mid 1800s. He was a Finnish Lutheran, and he saw all around him in Finland at the time suffering and violence and alcoholism and gambling and prostitution. Finland was not a happy place to be, the Russian boot, so to speak. Now, what Lars here decided would be best is a movement centered in Lutheranism that advocated for extreme temperance from anything. His followers would abstain from all drink, all gambling, almost all dance, almost all music. They were extremely ascetic and disciplined people. And at the time, this movement gained a lot of ground, and it was actually very successful, because that is really what Finland needed. Finland needed not only something that would guide them towards a more stoic and disciplined approach to the Russian oppression, but also something that would pull them back to their Lutheran roots. And so the Laestadian movement was very successful at the time, and through generations of Finnish immigrants to America, the Laestadian Church has a pretty significant following in many sizable pockets in the United States, one of them being the Pacific Northwest. Now, due to a split over doctrine that I totally didn't understand, a lot of the modern Laestadian movement is called the American Apostolic Lutheran Church. So if you've encountered them, and if you live in the Pacific Northwest, I'm sure you have, now you know where they come from and where that tradition has its roots. Now, setting aside Lars Laestadius, Finland suffered under the mistreatment of the Russian Empire until 1917, when Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown. And Finland actually was given, by the provisional government of the Russian Empire, its own Senate to elect representatives and to draft laws. It was the whole deal. Unfortunately, this Senate didn't last very long because, as you may know, in October, the Bolshevik Party under Vladimir Lenin overthrew the provisional government and installed what would later be known as Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union, or the USSR, depending on who you ask and at what time you ask. But at any rate, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, and along with seizing power, the Bolsheviks declared that any ethnic peoples in the Russian Empire could go essentially whatever way they chose to go. The Finns, deciding to get out while the getting was good, declared independence, and that was that. They left the Russian Empire. Now, as you've probably guessed, it really wasn't that easy because the Bolshevik Revolution had touched off quite a firestorm throughout the rest of Europe. And in Finland in particular, in January to May of 1918, Finland descended into the brutal chaos of a civil war. This civil war was fought between the whites, so-called, who were mostly capitalists, and the so-called reds, who were communists and SRs and that whole deal. And after 37,000 people died, the whites won the civil war. Finland became a republic, and a man with a very difficult to pronounce name named Carlo Juho Stalberg was elected its first president. And now that we've reached almost half an hour, I think that's as good a time as any to end our first episode. Next time on History with a Drywaller, I will be covering Finland from this declaration of a republic up till the present day. So I'll see you there.